watching this after the fact, I guess I'll try to cover some stuff that hopefully will be broadly interesting. And then if people have questions, either now or later, feel free to ask, of course. I'm going to move Zoom up onto my other monitor. So sorry that you'll have to look up my nose a little bit when I talk to all of you.
That's fine. I'm pretty sure I'm constantly making my students look at my hairline while I'm writing on my tablet on my desk, but the camera is down from above.
Yeah. Just give me 1 second here.
Just figured if we're talking about like mixing stuff, headphones might
That's
be
true.
like, helpful.
That is true. Yeah, actually, thanks, Laura. That's a really good point. So headphones are definitely very, very highly recommended as part of this. Definitely, if you have them, put them on. Oh, hang on 1 sec. I just realized I need to.
Oh, I guess I do have a
do this a
question.
different way. Yeah.
Do you usually mix with speakers or headphones?
Oh, that's a really good question. I just realized I don't usually use Zoom on this computer, and I have to set up dual monitors really quick. So while I do that, I will tell you that I use both, and I think it can be really dangerous to use only one or the other. And definitely, it's probably safest to use only headphones if you had to use one or the other. Excuse me, to use only monitors, not headphones. The reason for that being that typically monitors will have a much better full range response. Like there are really nice headphones that can do a good job of simulating, what you might expect if you had a real set of nice speakers in front of you, but there are not that many of them that can do that. So speakers
Which ones can?
a better way to go. Like typically open back headphones. So there's a lot of different brands available as usual. Capital Stream in action being what it is, but these are Sennheiser HD800s. They're pretty expensive. There's others that are not as expensive. The HD 600 from Sennheiser is a lot cheaper and still probably like 80% as good for most things. It's still not cheap, but it's open back headphones in general have a much better low frequency response. So
I'll have to check if mine are, because
yeah, there's a lot of things out there, but the main issue is that if you have only headphones, then it's not as easy to assess certain things about the mix, because you have only essentially two monaural signals, whereas if you have speakers and the sound is arriving at both ears from each speaker with sort of crosstalk, and your brain is more used to hearing that way, and you can often make better decisions about things like reverb or compression when you have that information. So that's one of the main reasons to do it. But then headphones, on the other hand, obviously if you're like in a space that's not good, or you don't have good speakers available, or you are deliberately trying to create something for people who will be listening on headphones primarily, there's lots of good reasons to use headphones too. So yeah. Can everyone see this in Reaper here? Yes, no, maybe?
Yes.
Great. Sorry, my screen is, for some reason, Zoom is being really weird on this computer and I don't see the gallery view. I'm just sharing and relying on your verbal input. So, and let's just make sure that this sounds reasonably like full range. I have all the high quality stuff enabled, but just to let me know, I'll play like a couple seconds, you can tell me. Does that sound like not super crappy, but just medium crappy, I guess, whatever Zoom's high fidelity is doing these days?
It sounds okay.
Pretty good, actually.
Yeah,
okay, great,
great.
Yeah, so this is a session from a couple weeks ago that I did, and I just thought it would be a really good example for some basic workflow stuff to go over, because it's not too complicated, and we can go through the tracks and go through a mixing process. So this is I typically use PureMix. So this is in Reaper, which I'm using as a backup recorder on this computer. I can't really share my screen with PureMix the way that it runs audio through ASIO drivers. It's really hard to share that in Zoom in a seamless way. So I'm going to just sort of recreate a lot of what I do in Reaper instead, which is probably better because a lot of people I know in the group are using Reaper anyway. So this is exactly how it looked when I recorded it. There's no, I have the main left and main right channels panned, but other than that, if I bring up the mixer, you can see like there's no effects, there's no changes to anything. So we can just start from scratch together and just go through it. This is all Renaissance or very, very early Baroque music, some nice stuff. It's a lot of Machaut and Dufay and stuff like that. So first of all, just to go through these channels, these are named for the microphones that were used for these spot mics. So there's 4 channels of spot microphones and 2 channels left and right for main microphones. That made sense to me the way I was doing it, but we'll listen through and it'll be obvious what is what. And then if you see this track right here, you can see how these are much lower in level. That mic was actually left open and recorded, but I just didn't bother to turn it off, but it was not in use for this particular part of the session. So we can just listen through quickly and get a sense for what these different different mics sound like. And I guess first, does anyone have any quick questions before I jump in with that?
I guess I'm curious as to why it's like split up into little segments.
Oh, like
Or
like
are
these?
these like
Yeah,
different pieces?
those are different takes of the same piece. Exactly. Yep.
Oh, okay.
So, and it's certainly possible to just do one really long recording and then chop it up after into the takes, but I typically don't do that for 2 reasons, which is, first of all, it takes a lot of extra time to go through if it's a long session and segment out the parts you want. And more importantly, even though like modern software like Reaper and stuff is pretty stable, if you're doing one track for the whole recording, just letting it run and run and run, if somehow there's a crash or whatever, you lose everything. Whereas, you know, if you stop and start after each track, you know, if it crashes on take 13, you still have the other 12 takes successfully recorded. So it's kind of a safety policy too. So as I set this up, I was thinking I should just go through everything and I'll try to make it pretty quick. But so before we even listen to these, I like to organize them a little bit. To be clear, what's happening here is there's 2 tracks that correspond to like 2 main stereo, you know, a stereo pair on a stand picking up the whole ensemble. And then there's 3, because remember one of these was actually not used, there's 3 close mics on the performers so that we can have some balance adjustment and get a little bit of extra detail from the vocalist in particular. So before even getting into listening to these, I like to make groups, and I want to save this for the video so we can go over it. I like to make groups so that I can quickly listen to, you know, just the main mics, just the spot mics, that kind of thing. And there's different ways you can do this with linking them. One easy way is to just put them into folders is what they're called in Reaper. There's typically ways to do this in almost every DAW. So what I'm going to do is just create 2 new tracks, and I'm going to call one of them mains, and I'm going to call the other spots. And then if you move this track up here, you can see this is an empty track, but what we're going to do is nest the 2 main tracks inside of it. So I select them, and then once they're selected, if you drag them up into this folder or this track above, it becomes a folder, and you can tell that that's happening because this blue line that goes across will have this little increment like that. It's kind of subtle, but that's all the way. And then when you see that little indent and you let go, now they're nested inside of that parent track. And you can see in the waveform here, the waveforms of the child tracks is now shown there. So now if I want to listen to both the main microphones, I could, for example, solo this parent track and I'll hear them. So I hope that makes sense. I'm going to just repeat that for the spots. So I'll move it here and see, that's not what I want. It actually ended up jumping inside there, which we don't want. So if I move it out until I see that blue line extend all the way. That's how Reaper sort of tells you the hierarchy. So now it's back to where I want it. I'm going to select the 4 spot mics and move them inside like that. So there we have it. And last but not least, I'm going to mute this unused track because we don't need to even worry about this at all. We could listen to it later just for the hell of it. But so any questions on that? Does that make sense to everybody? Great. So if we listen, I'll just play a few seconds of just the mains so people can check out how that sounds, and then a few seconds from the same spot with the spot mics. So here's the main left and right. So as you can hear, that's a pretty like full sonic picture, but it has a lot of reverb. It's in a large church, and so this is very common that, you know, with the main mics, there might be a little bit more reverb than you want, and then you can supplement. If you have close microphones, you can supplement more direct sound and get a better balance. If you only had 2 mics to work with, you know, this position for the main microphones might have been a little bit too far. But if you do have this other approach where you're relying on a combination of main microphones and spot microphones, it's often kind of nice to have a little extra ambience in the main microphones, and then you can sort of create a much more spacious mix, which is what we're going to do right now. So just to listen to the spots, they sound like this. So obviously that's a much drier and more direct sound, which is what you want. But as you can hear, you would probably not want to listen to just that on its own. And that's sort of deliberate. You know, when you're using this kind of technique, you might put the spot mics a little extra close and the main mics a little extra far. And, you know, it's a lot of just personal taste stuff for the aesthetic. The other thing you may have noticed is right now, all of these 3 spot microphones are panned mono, like dead center. So it sounds very unnatural, whereas the main microphones are hard left and hard right. So the first thing we'll probably want to do is pan the spot mics so that they reflect the actual position of the performers, which was singer in the center, and then I believe for this one it was 2 Baroque violins. There's also a lute in one track, but in any case, the 2 instrumentalists are on either side. So I'm gonna just pan that while playing this back, and we're gonna just listen to the spots again, but panning it to get that sounding right. So here we go. So that's the vocal. And so that's already sounding a lot more natural. And then what I'm doing is trying to build a sort of proportional mix with the balance between these 3 close microphones, because they were just recorded at a nominal gain. And there's obviously some balance issues where the vocal is not quite loud enough, in my opinion. So I'm going to play it back for another couple seconds and try to make just the close mics have their own sort of mix where they sound pretty good relative to each other. And of course, later we can choose how much of the close mics relative to the main mics are used. But at least everyone has their own way of working. For me, I like to know that as a sort of subgroup, these are kind of on a firm foundation, so to speak, before I move on to the next step. So let's do that real quick. That was muted. I don't know if anyone caught that. That was my fault. I was soloing the whole parent and not this is the vocal. I'm going to just rename these really quick because this is going to be much more logical. So that's vocal, and we'll just call this instrument 1 and instrument 2. Apologies for that. Let's listen one more time. Okay, so that's sounding reasonably good to me. And then another thing that's good to do is I quickly will check that against the mains. So what I mean by that is now that I have a sort of mix here for my close mics, I'll listen to them and then mute them and listen to the main microphones. And what I'm gonna listen for is just to make sure that the position doesn't seem to like jump from the spot close mics versus the mains. Because for example, if I didn't do a good job with my panning, if it seems like in the main microphones, you know, one of the violinists is here, but they're actually like over here in the close mics, that's gonna sort of blur the sound stage, as it's sometimes called. So let's check that real quick. Okay, that's it's not perfect, but I'm happy with that for our purposes right now. That's one thing that you can, you know, play around with quite a bit, and especially if there's a lot more microphones, you know, there's a whole sort of art to massaging that, but we don't need to go too deep into it. Does anyone have any questions at this stage before I keep going?
Question. How did you get the tracks to nest again?
Oh, sure.
Was missing out.
No, sure. You want to see how that works?
Yes.
Okay, no problem. So I'm just going to create a few new tracks down here and just redo it again. So all I'm doing is double clicking, or you could hit Control T in Reaper to create a new empty track. And but of course, this could be ones you already have. And once you have the tracks you want to deal with, all you have to do is leave one of them extending here all the way to the left like that, and then select the ones that you want to make its sort of child tracks. And having selected all of them, you drag them. You just click and drag. And as your cursor moves up into the track above, if that blue line extends all the way, it's not gonna nest them. But as soon as you see that little indent, I'm trying to rock it back and forth. As soon as you see that little blue indentation, then when you release, the tracks become nested. And you can easily take them out again if you want by selecting all the ones you want to take out and dragging them again, but the other way, so that then you see, you know, the blue line will go all the way and it'll undo it and you can back them out. So it's pretty straightforward. And again, there's other ways you can group tracks, like you can link them in Reaper so that like when I move the volume on one, all of the other ones that are linked go up and down. But one of the reasons I prefer doing it in groups like this is that another thing that's very common in this way of working is that you might want to put a little bit of reverb on all of the close mics so that they gel a little bit better with the main mics. And if they're all in a group like this, I can put one reverb on my spot mics channel right here, and then that will affect all of these because they all feed through this spot mic channel before they go to the stereo master. And that way you only need one reverb for all of them. Whereas, you know, if you had like 4 channels of close mics that were all linked, so you move one of them and the volumes all go up and down, but they're still independent channels. And if you wanted to put a reverb on them, you'd have to put a reverb on each channel individually. So hope that makes sense. Any other questions?
If you like drag something onto a track that already has audio on it, will it turn that into a folder? Is that a thing?
If you drag something, you mean like if I drag a track from outside of this session, like a new piece of material into here? Or?
No, I'm just saying if so you know, you made the folders by creating blank tracks.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Right. So no, you could I could do it right here. So I'll take my main track and nest it into the main left, and you can have cascading levels of this. So yeah, it doesn't have to be an empty track. For my purposes, I want it to be an empty track because I'm not trying to add any material, but it's just something that Reaper does with like the hierarchy of how the tracks work. So in theory, there's, yeah, it doesn't matter what's in the track or not in the track to,
So like in that case, if I adjusted anything on in that case, 2, it would adjust the thing that was nested inside it, but not vice versa.
yeah, so like exactly. So for example, if I have these nested like this, if I go to my main left track and I put a reverb on in there, that will affect this track and this child track. But if I put, you know, EQ on main right, that's not going to affect main left. So
Cool.
yeah,
That is good to know.
yeah, very good point. Thanks for bringing that up. Any other questions? And also I should mention, if anyone, you know, if something like this isn't making sense because, you know, you're more familiar with a different DAW, please, you know, mention that and I'll be happy to try to explain, because I think Reaper is a good sort of common denominator, but obviously it's not super logical for everybody. So I could try to frame this, you know, like in Ableton Live Speak, if that's what you use, or in, you know, something else. So. All right. So at this point, we have, you know, a decent sort of mix here, and there's other stuff that I might do, you know, if we had more time and this was part of like a real sort of production. I mean, it would be unlikely you would have recorded all of these takes and then you're just going to use one take. You know, you'd probably be making an edit, and that's something we could go into another time. It's pretty time consuming, and it's actually not that difficult. It's more just time consuming and takes a certain amount of practice to become quick with it, but it wouldn't probably be that interesting to look at. Other than I did want to go over how to like move around and split tracks and do fades and stuff if people want to do people want to review that, or do people know that who are on the meeting? Sorry, again, I don't have the gallery view, so I'm just relying on your verbal
I was going to
responses.
say I'm fine with fades and splitting tracks, but also I think Daniel had a question.
No.
I
Stop sharing for a second.
I had a question.
Yeah.
And maybe you want to address it later, because we're going to be doing some projects, some things that are recorded like this, which is a chamber music piece, right?
Yep.
But we're also going to be doing a lot of pieces where there are parts that are recorded separately that have to be synchronized.
Yep.
And I was wondering if you had anything to say about that as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, this totally factors into all of this, so I don't think there's any things we like shouldn't touch on, and happy to talk about that. So if you're talking about, you know, like you record a bunch of stuff separately and then you're going to sync it together, it's just music, like as that is to say not video as well. There's obviously different ways you can do it. One way would be to use a click. A lot of people use a click track, but if it's something that doesn't rely on metronomic time and it just needs to like all start at the same time and it's more open-ended or something like that, you can pretty much use any kind of, you know, like a clap or some sort of sharp transient information that everyone does, and with the understanding that that will then be the point of alignment. So I can quickly show how you would sort of take some tracks and move them around to do that. But the main thing is it's I guess, to put it another way, the main thing is not so much like how do you align it, but just how do you come up with a good mechanism to get everyone to do it the right way. Because if it's not all done consistently with each part, it can be a big pain trying to align it after the fact. But if it's all done consistently, it kind of works itself out, and it's just a few minutes of like moving stuff around a bit. So
I will add that I did this kind of thing for my summer ZFest project, and a clap is a very useful way of getting people to line up. I had a click track, but then it was like 1, 2, 3, 4, clap, 2,
Mhm.
3, 4, and then everyone would clap there, and I just align everything to that. So
Yeah. And actually something I'll add that's very, can be very useful is despite having maybe, you know, a very good internal sense of time, the, the mechanics of human anatomy means it's very hard to do this at like an absolutely perfect, you know, time interval. So it can be good to do like 2 or 3 claps. Like if you have a metronome, have someone clap on 3 consecutive beats or something. And that way, if someone's like a little bit off, because the issue is like if you have one indicator of where the time is and the person, their clap is like a little bit off, you could line up their clap correctly, but now like their part drifts a little bit. And then later it turns out like, oh, you know, everything's like, you know, sort of like a 30-second note off or something, and it gets really annoying. So if they have a couple claps, it makes it more obvious if one was like a little early or a little late. You can sort of average it out and figure that out. It saves time. Yeah, that's another good point. Okay, well, I can just take like a 90-second detour and jump back into Reaper, and we can just pretend that, so these tracks right here, can everyone see that? I'm gonna just zoom in pretty close, and we can pretend that these are tracks that need to be synchronized. And let's say, so there's a period of silence or near silence right here. So let's say that like that's where we're gonna sync them to. And in this kind of situation, I would typically make a marker. So if you hit Shift M, or you can right click and bring up this menu, markers are great. I would highly recommend that you use them. So you type in what you want it to be called in a little dialog box, and then insert it into the timeline. And not only is this good because it gives you like a visual indication of what's going on, but also if you split a track that you want to align. So let me zoom in pretty close on this one right here. So if I go to this, maybe like right here is going to be the start of the track. So if I move this here, I can see very clearly how that's lining up. And then, you know, if this was going to be the beginning of another track, I could do the same thing. And tracks will also snap to this. You know, if you cut them into a subsection and then you want to move them around, they can snap to that as if it were like a bar or beat indicator. Like you see the way that scale up there has the increments, and the cursor can snap to them. They can snap to your markers too, like that. So it can be even more useful that way. So that's pretty much how I would line stuff up, and you just line it up, listen, you know, move this a little bit, line it up, you know, listen. It's sort of a cyclical process. And right now I'm zoomed in pretty close, but this is like from left to right. We're looking at 1:48. We're looking at like about like 1/10 of a second, I guess, maybe a little bit. No, it's got to be more than that. These are seconds. That's hours, minutes. That's what I'm looking at. So yeah, this is not super close. What I'm getting at is, you know, if this were really like something that required very precise alignment, you might want to make the track bigger this way, because it makes it easier to see, and then zoom in like really far, like to that level, you know. And you can zoom in so far that you're actually starting to see like individual, like the wave itself. So, you know, to see the individual samples right here, that would be overkill. But, you know, like you might want to be even somewhere around like this close to really do it properly. If it was, you know, let's say a fast tempo with very rhythmic figures that needed to really interlock precisely, you might want to go in like really close to move it around. So I hope that makes sense. I'll jump out of full screen if anyone wants to ask any questions, but it's pretty straightforward to do. Cool. All right. So let me fix my tracks here. I made them all really big to do that. All right. Back into Reaper. So here we are again with our little mock session. And just to refresh everyone's memory, I'll keep going here a little bit. We made the mains and the spots in these folders and then balanced the spots so that they sound reasonably good and panned them. And now we can work on creating a rough mix of all this together and add some effects and polish it a little bit. I'm also going to color code. I really like making things colorful. So at least for me, I find it really helpful, especially if you have a lot of tracks. So in Reaper, that's easy to do. You right click and you can set things to random colors, custom colors, whatever. So I'm gonna select my mains and we'll make them a random color, and then these guys, and we'll make them a random color. That's actually much more similar than it usually is. That's kind of unhelpful. There we go. So that just makes it a little easier, especially if you have multiple categories. You know, this is something I would really recommend. Like if you have a large session where you have like some acoustic instruments, some electronic sounds, you know, stuff that needs to be grouped in different ways, the colors can really be helpful to do that. So let's listen again to this for a sec. Okay, so that's sounding pretty okay to me just as is. I mean, obviously we'd want to do some fine tuning. One thing I want to just show, because I won't belabor this in the video, but I want to play it back and I'll fade in the mains like this while it's playing. I think that'll be helpful to sort of get a sense of what it does to bring them in and, you know, out at different levels. So that would be one way to sort of assess how much you want. So we'll start out with no mains at all, and I'll start bringing them in, and you'll be able to hear the ambiance really come in quite a bit. So here's that. So that's a pretty decent blend to my ears for now, for just a quick and dirty mix. And then I think it would be good to go into some of the sort of post-processing mixing type stuff that I would typically do. So one of the main things I would do in a situation like this is add some compression, which is sort of often considered like a no-no, but to be clear, what I'm doing here is not at all like putting, you know, like Beatles style pop compression on the entire thing. We're going to use a technique that's called parallel compression. The idea is that you keep the dry signal as is, but you make a parallel compressed version of it, and you blend that in at a much lower level. And without going into all the details, essentially that creates a little bit more fullness and a little bit more of a kind of impression of detail when you bring up the lower level details because of the compression. But because you're not sort of like squashing down the entire mix, it doesn't give it that compressed sound, and it remains very dynamic and open. So I use compression pretty regularly for like classical and acoustic music, but only parallel compression in that way and at like a low level, like really gentle, but it does make a really helpful difference for a lot of stuff. So I'm going to quickly jump into that. I'm going to put that on the entire master track here because I want that to affect the entire mix. So I'm going to go into the effects tab here and open that up. And I'm going to use, there's a really nice plugin from Softube that models a very famous hardware dynamics processor from Vice. Can you guys see that? I hope. That plugin?
Yes.
Okay, good. I know Zoom sometimes does this weird bug where like the plugins aren't, or the pop.
Oh, there it is. It had been really grainy, but it's.
Okay, you see it now? Yes?
Yes.
Okay,
Is
great. Thank you.
DS1
Got it.
MK3 the name of the plugin?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And that's the name of the, it's a hardware, they modeled it after the original that was called that. So I'm gonna do this twice, once with this, and then once with the Reaper compressor plugin, because we're gonna do the same thing. You can do it either way. So with this, there's a ton of parameters, and a lot of them can be semi-ignored for this, but they actually have a setting for this, parallel compression, so we'll turn that on. And then the key when you're doing compression in this way, parallel compression, so we're going to look mostly at this section here in the lower right. The threshold should be very, very low. So typically for a compressor, you might set it like somewhere sort of in the range of the program material. But for parallel compression, the point of it is to like bring up the low level detail. So we're going to set it really low. Like I'm going to set it, not all the way down because it'll just bring up, some background noise, but I'll set it at like maybe -50 or something. So that means even really quiet sounds will be affected by this compressor. But similarly, for the ratio of how much compression we're applying, it's pretty typical for like pop type stuff. You easily would probably even more than 2 to 1. You might see 4 to 1 or 6 to 1 if you're trying to get like a really thick drum sound. And this is like absolutely not what we're trying to do in this case. So I'm going to keep it even below 2 to 1. I'll probably keep it at like 1.6 and change to 1, somewhere around there, 1.5 to 1. So it's not like a night and day difference. We're just trying to increase the low level detail a little bit. And
Sorry, question?
Please interrupt if anything is unclear.
Yeah, the ratio, what do those numbers refer to?
So I can actually show this a little bit better maybe in the Reaper compressor. So I'm just going to bring that up and we can take a look. I'm going to try to hook this up real quick so that I'm going to play this back but mute the master so you can see the meters moving but hear my voice. So is that, you guys still hearing me?
Yes.
So basically right now I have this is the threshold here. This is the Reaper compressor. The threshold is here and it's at 0, which means it's not doing anything because the signal would have to cross the max level at 0 to do anything. So as I bring the threshold down, we're going to see red in this meter. And that red is the gain reduction meter. It's showing how much compression is being applied. So right now I have the threshold somewhere kind of in the middle, and you can see as the signal goes above the threshold, we get some gain reduction here. If I bring the threshold down more, we'll get more of that compression. And what the ratio does is it controls how much compression is applied. The threshold just adjusts where does the compression occur, but the ratio adjusts how much. So if I set the ratio back to 1, you'll see the gain reduction meter doesn't do anything because it's a 1-to-1. So there's nothing happening. And mathematically, it's basically like a transfer function for dynamics. So if the ratio is 1-to-1, anything that's a 1 in is going to be a 1 out, and there's no change. If I set the ratio to 1.5-ish, then essentially what that means is that if something comes in at a given level, the compressor will effectively reduce its dynamic range by a factor of 1.5. And typically, in general, that would make the sound softer. If you think about it, if you're taking like, basically what the compressor does is like, if a sound comes that's louder than this arbitrary threshold, make it softer. So you would think like, because you're compressing it, then you would think like, why would I want to do that? Why would that help the details come out or something like that? And the reason is typically you don't just leave it that way. You do what's called makeup gain. The Reaper has a very handy auto makeup checkbox right here, which you can see. If you check that, or if you have like a makeup gain dial that you adjust, then you're compensating for the fact that you made the signal softer by making up the difference, bringing it back up. Only now you have more of a kind of thick sound with more of the detail brought up. I hope that makes sense. Any questions on that?
Seamus wants to know what the knee size is.
I'm just curious since it
Yeah.
sounds so funny.
Yeah, I forget why they call it a knee, but it's actually a really useful feature. Actually, if I go back to the other compressor, this can show you a little bit, I think, better what's going on. So hang on one second here. Okay, so can everyone see that one again?
Yeah.
Okay, so I know this right here, this graph is a little hard to see, but this is showing you the transfer function of what the compressor is doing. So if I bring the threshold to a certain amount, and then if I move the ratio, you can see how that's changing, going up and down, and the threshold affects it as well. So this is the knee. Sometimes it's called a soft knee. Sometimes it's just called a knee. It basically affects how sharp or how smooth the point is between what's above the threshold and what's below the threshold. So the easiest way to show you that, if I make it 0, and now I change the ratio, you see how it's just sharp? Basically, if I do it like this, I basically created a limiter, but I have a situation where below here, there's no effect. And then as soon as you hit this threshold, wherever it is, which, I can change where the threshold is, as soon as you hit it, you just like flatline maximum effect on any signal above that threshold. And you don't always want that because it can sound unnatural. So with the knee, if I bring that in, you'll see that it basically, as I increase it, it softens that corner. And it basically means if you have something that looks like this instead, the compressor will start to kick in gradually as you get into this range. And it's not like that where there's no effect, no effect, no effect, tons of compression. So it helps you sculpt the way that it interacts with the music, if that makes sense.
And it looks like a knee, so I understand why it's called.
It does kind of look, that's probably why.
It does look like a knee.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess if the knee size is small, it's a very sharp knee.
Yep, a sharp knee. It
This
sounds
would be quite a subtle
over.
effect if you were only listening to it and not watching the graph, though.
Yes, it's true. That and even if you have high, a high ratio and it's like a pretty significant compression effect, the knee is not like a night or day difference thing that you hear. It's just something that helps the compressor sound like a little bit more transparent or something in certain cases. So, but I'm gonna actually leave it on for this. So I'm gonna unmute the master and we can just listen to this for a second. I might fine tune a couple things and then I'll talk again when I have this ready to bypass, and you guys can just hopefully check out something interesting from it while I do that for 30 seconds or so. Okay, so I have this set up now, sort of very cursory setup, but basically I adjusted the makeup gain a little bit to compensate for the fact that I was making it quieter. So I'm adding back in 3 dB of gain. But I think you will hopefully be able to hear, it's not a extremely intense effect, but I'm gonna just play it back. And with this button right here, I'm gonna bypass it on and off a few times. And I hope you'll be able to hear that when it's on, when this is dark, it sounds a little bit sort of fuller and a little more like 3-dimensional maybe, especially the quality of the reverb or the small details kind of come through a bit more. And if it's bypassed like this, it doesn't sound bad or that different, but it's just a little bit kind of flatter and a little bit less immersive, maybe you could say. So I'll just do that quickly and see what you think. I'll start with it bypassed and I'll go with it on, with it bypassed, with it on a few times. So here is with nothing, with it bypassed. So how was that? Any small impressions created at least, I hope, maybe?
Yeah, I guess I can I guess the well, when you don't have the compression on, I can hear the
Oh, there's
spot
some really
mics
funny
and
jokes in the chat. I'm sorry. I'm just catching up on this.
oh yeah.
Oh, cuckoo. You guys. That's
Sorry, I was just I can hear like more of a separation between the spot mics and room mics, I guess,
Mhm. Yeah.
without the compression.
That's one of the main reasons why I think it can be helpful to use it, because there's different ways you could address that, but definitely if you have like a drier sound from close microphones and then a more distant sound from stereo pair, you typically don't want that ideally, right? So yeah, I know. Isn't that weird with the trilled R's? It's like a historical diction thing, I believe.
I think I heard from a singer that actually a lot of people do that because trying to sing like a French R at the back of the throat can be tricky.
It
Oh yeah,
sounds
that's a bitch.
sounds tricky. Yeah, yeah.
So it is Old French.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
This is like 16th century or maybe a little later. Yeah,
You said Musho, right?
yeah. So they had a couple that were like I wasn't familiar with that were quite old, and then later some Macho and some Dufay.
Right. I wasn't here at the beginning, so I
Oh,
was
no worries.
thinking, like, is this old Portuguese?
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I know it sounds pretty cool. There's some weird pronunciation actually, but other things too. But anyway, so yeah, so basically, if you have these close mics that have a dry sound, right? You're trying to integrate them to get a more blended sound. If you, like I think I mentioned earlier, you could put some reverb on the close microphones, and then that would make them a little bit more compatible. But it's like if something is too salty and then like now you're adding sugar to make the salt less noticeable or something. It's like it can be kind of bad to do that. So, if you add more reverb to something that doesn't necessarily need reverb, but simply because you want it to gel better with another thing, it can be less effective than if you just use something like compression. Kind of by nature causes everything to sort of intermingle better, typically in my experience. And I should also mention what I'm coming from here is definitely like a sort of classical acoustic background for this type of work. So like all of these things I'm doing, it's not a night and day difference. I have like a couple other things I wanted to quickly show you guys, but each one is like we're changing, 5%, 7%, maybe 8% here. And then the sum of them all, if you like bypass everything, it will be like, oh wow, that sounds, a lot nicer. But no one stage of this is like a crazy sound, design step or anything. Yeah.
There's very little tangible about it. It's just that sort of the air shimmers a little bit more somehow.
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. Definitely. And also, I think it kind of draws your attention back to the fact that like mic placement and stuff like that is super important. Like if you don't have things set up right to begin with for this way of working, there's certain things you can do, of course, but it's not going to fix it. So it's definitely, and that's sort of a philosophical thing. Like there's nothing wrong with when people like to do like huge chains of effects to like really sculpt stuff, but that would obviously be inappropriate with this kind of material. So the goal is to like get the microphones in the right place, get it sounding like pretty good, just sort of out of the box once you make a few adjustments, and then sort of sculpt it into something that's like a little more, sort of polish it. Or I cook a lot, so I think a lot of like food analogies for this, but it's sort of like the seasoning or something. It's like you already have the ingredients, so to speak. So with that in mind, I'm going to jump back in. Do we have any more questions? Yeah, Julian, you're definitely right about that. But there's weird things like so the word like choisi, they pronounce it like choisi, which is like really weird.
Patrick Swayze.
Yeah. Yeah, the compression is the oven. That's a nice. We should come up with like a whole cookbook analogy. That's a good idea. Okay.
We need to come up with something fun for the knee.
Yeah, it feels like compression, like it's what helps capture that magic, those resonant effects you get when you're hearing multiple instruments in a room and you're actually there, and that gets lost. It's like you're managing to recover little bits of that or something.
Yeah, that's a nice, I like that. So can you guys see this again? I hope all these windows.
Yeah.
Great. So I'm putting in one more thing that I would recommend you guys check out. This is actually a free plugin from Softube. It's a really useful one that does saturation. So it's not exactly like tape saturation, but it essentially adds harmonic distortion, which again, you might think, oh, that's, you know, something that I wouldn't want, right? But again, if you use it in a sparing amount, it can be really, really effective. And so this is something I actually probably wouldn't use on this material in general because it's pretty good as is. And I don't like to mess with stuff too much. But you know, if you recorded, for example, in a room that's not ideal, or with a microphone that's not ideal, that doesn't capture like all of the higher partials quite as clearly, you know, from your instrument, it can be really useful if you add a little bit of harmonic distortion, you know, that will impose higher even order harmonics onto the material in a way that can make it sound kind of fuller and brighter and richer in a good way. So I'm going to just play this for a second. I'll crank it up really high so you can hear what's happening, and then I'll dial it way back, and then we can do the bypass thing again. And I'm curious if you guys like it. I think it's very useful. So this will be really over the top. So that's kind of like the Jimi Hendrix approach, but I'm gonna back it off now. I'll play it from the same level and back it off, and you can hear how that sounds. And then I'll bypass it a few times like this. So when the checkbox is off, you'll know you're not hearing it, and when it's on, you will be hearing it. Okay, so here we go. So it's pretty subtle, but I think the main thing that you'll hear, especially if you mess around with it on your own, which I encourage you to do, because like I said, it's free. Excuse me. In things like bowed strings or vocals, you know, for consonants or like s sounds, those kind of things just get a little bit sparklier and a little bit richer. And then if you compare it with it bypassed, if you have it, you know, dialed in just a little bit, what you'll typically hear is it just feels a little bit like smaller and more one-dimensional. And when it's on, it's not really perceived as distortion. That's the idea, or even saturation, but it's just things just feel a little sparklier somehow.
Feels like there's an extra harmonic or two ringing out of basically everything. Is that
there definitely
accurate?
is. That's what's going on.
Okay.
But if it's pushed too hard, you really hear it. Like you can hear that's an octave above, that's 2 octaves above as like a ring. But if it's much, much lower, you don't really perceive it that way. And it's more just like a little bit of extra zing. And like I said, if you record something like really pristinely and you're happy with how the sound is, I'm not advocating for like putting this on everything, but especially as a way to get a little more kind of dimension to stuff that you might not be crazy about how it currently sounds, I definitely recommend saturation. I think it's really overlooked as a mix tool.
I guess if you're in like a dry space and you lose a lot of that, then it could be helpful.
Yep. If it's dry. And another thing that can be nice is if you have a mic position that's kind of lackluster in one way or another, you know, like for example, if you're recording a piano and it's in a small room, you have to put the microphone somewhere that it's not picking up a ton of like harmonic material from the instrument, but it's getting like a sort of muffled piano sound. A little bit of that kind of saturation, for example, could help to bring out more clarity, because the way it works is very different from EQ, obviously. So yeah, EQ, I was intending to do a little bit, but it looks like we're basically out of time. But honestly, EQ is not that, it's not a mystery. I'll just show you one thing. So this is a technique. I'll do this really quick, Shoshana. I know we're, okay, so I'm gonna just pick a track arbitrarily and put an EQ in it. I'll pick the vocal track and use the Reaper EQ here. So this is a really good technique for deciding how to use EQ, figuring out what to do. Just make it really big here. So typically on a track like a vocal track, you may want to use a high pass filter. You may want to cut out the low frequencies. Like for example, if we look at this graph, you know, we're cutting out a little bit starting at 200 Hertz, and we're not really taking out anything major until we get way down here to 100 Hertz or below. Obviously, that's not going to come out of any human vocalist. So in other words, anything that's in that region is just going to be rumble or some other kind of like ambient noise that you might not want. So people will often cut out stuff like that just to help clean up the mix a little bit. But that said, people do sometimes overdo it, and it's not necessary to do that. If you don't hear a problem, you don't need to EQ it. So that's the main point I want to make is, you know, the EQ was invented to compensate for the deficiencies of early music recording equipment that didn't have a linear frequency response. So you needed to equalize, you know, to boost the bass or to reduce something. The goal was like to fix a problem, basically. Not to say you can't use it creatively, but it's just good to remember, like, if you listen to something, it's like, wow, that sounds great. Don't EQ it. There's no reason to EQ it. If you listen to something, you're like, I'm not happy with this certain thing, then maybe EQ can help. And so the technique I wanted to show that's super easy is, let's just make this flat. If you think there might be an issue with a track, like there's some weird resonance or something you don't like, a really easy way to EQ it that I highly recommend, and it's good for ear training, just pick a band like this and leave it pretty broad. You can see how this is pretty broad, the boost, but we might want to make it even a little sharper than this. So you can come down to the bandwidth, or sometimes it's called the Q control here. And so we can make it a little narrower, like something like that maybe. And then what I recommend is just make this really high, boost it, you know, like 10, 20 dB. And as you listen to the track, just move it around like this as you listen. And if there's a problem, like if something is really, there's like a weird resonance in the bass, as you come into that region, it's gonna like explode out at you. And by fine tuning this, it'll make it really obvious where the problem is. And let's say you're like, okay, right here, there's this bass resonance I don't like. And then as soon as you found it and it's really like ringing out twice as hard because you're boosting it, all you do is go to your gain control and invert this and make it into a cut. And then listen to it as you now begin to pull it out. And if you go too far, like, you know, that is going to sound probably really bad and unnatural, but maybe somewhere in here is going to sound pretty good. And then you can also experiment with making it broader or sharper, depending on what kind of noise you're trying to affect. And, you know, similarly, if it's something way up high, you know, you might make this really narrow and sweep around, and you find like, oh, there's this kind of like sound that I don't like. So it's right around here, and I'm gonna now take it out. So I'll do this and just make it a cut instead of a boost. But then, you know, it's kind of a white noisy like thing. So if I cut it, you know, really sharp like this, that's not gonna do the trick. I mean, it's a broadband thing, like a noise I'm trying to remove. So instead I'll make it much more shallow. But now it's like I'm really cutting out a lot of the high end, and that might be weird. So maybe now like I make it a gentler cut, you know, and you just sort of work step by step like that after you identify the issue. I think that's a really good basic approach. So I hope that makes sense if anyone hasn't seen that before. Any last questions? Or I'm going to look in the chat really quick, but feel free to ask while I do that.
I have a question about Reaper usage in general.
Yeah.
Question about what?
So I watch tutorial videos every now and then some people will like use a different track for their VSTs and they'll bus the original over to there.
Mhm.
Other people will just use them on the original track. Is there a real like, is this like a preference thing, or are there real benefits to either of these strategies?
I would say that probably in like 95% of cases, it's just a preference thing. One of the advantages of creating separate buses. So for anyone who's not following that, basically that would be, you remember when we made like the track folders, this would be like kind of the same idea. You make additional tracks whose purpose is only to hold effects that do different things. And then you send various things into them, even though they don't have any audio. And probably one of the main reasons to do that would be to, like if you want to add or remove tracks from the session, you don't have to worry it's going to mess up all your effects, because like you set up your effects in these certain tracks, like here's my reverb, here's my blah blah blah, and now like, oh, I want to add like 6 more tracks and I want them to have reverb, like no problem, I'll just send them to the reverb track that I made for that purpose. So if you have like a more flexible type of workflow, that could be really useful. But if it's like, if in this session I was showing you guys, we have like 6 or 7 tracks, we're not going to add any more, we know what we're doing basically. There's no reason in my mind not to just like put it in there. So yeah. And as far as ear training, Lily, I would say that basically one of the best things to do can be to just use EQs in that way I was describing, just to listen to what happens when you do that. And I have a feeling, especially if you pick like music that you've recorded, that it's yourself or something really intimately well, if you start messing around with it in that way, after a while you'll get a much kind of sharper instinct for like, oh, I hear something, there's a weird sound, this is this kind of thing. And it's not like you're going to immediately be like, oh, that's sounds like 7300 hertz, there's a problem clearly. But in like broad ranges, you'll be able to hear like, oh, there's something like in the super low end, it's definitely messed up, like it's definitely like below 200 hertz, or like this is definitely like a like it's definitely like 6 kilohertz, 8 kilohertz, like somewhere there you'll have an instinct for like knowing what it sounds like when there's a weird sound in a certain basic zone. And that's super helpful. Yeah, we should do Nickelback next time. We'll do it like a Nickelback remix. I can't believe I didn't think of that. That would have been an awesome counterpoint to this.
Get some of those Chad Kroger vocal stems.
Yeah, let's try to do that. I bet there's tons of stuff. Like, no, Shannon, we're gonna do it. I'm sorry, it's already been decided. Yeah, we should take this. It's perfect anyway because no one speaks medieval French. So we should take this and do like a remix and put a Nickelback like a vocal stem on this.
Maybe one of the bigger second phase of Unacademy projects can be those bardcore remakes that people have been doing on YouTube.
Yeah.
And then Nickelback.
We need to do it with like a Hendrix style compression on top.
Oh, of course.
And that is how thou dost remind me of who I really am.
Guitar chords. Actually, on a not quite related note, apparently Takamitsu and Verez met at the movie theater, and what they were watching was one of the Beatles movies. So there's a fun story.
Go back
that's awesome. Well, I hope that was helpful. And like I said, if anyone has questions or if anyone watches this later and has questions, please let me know. And I think it would be really probably helpful if someone has like a specific thing they want to work on. It'd be better to just find a time to do like a one-on-one or with a small group, but like to focus on something, because it's a huge topic. So yeah, feel free to keep in touch if anything comes up, and hope it was helpful.
It was really helpful. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Luke.
Really good.
You're welcome. All right.